Frigate 0.10 has been released. It includes some breaking changes as well as some cool new features. So let's get right into some of the config file changes you'll need to make, as well as some observations and talk about some of those cool new features. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into the documentation and see what has changed in version 0.10. I'll have a link for this down below in the description as well. This is release 0.10, and there are major changes, including a breaking change or two here. The camera names are the biggest breaking change. You'll need to make sure that the camera names are URL safe, which means that they can only have A through Z, upper and lowercase, 0 through 9, dashes and underscores, no spaces or anything else. So if your camera has to be renamed, any of the associated events with that camera will be retained as long as you have your global retain settings set up properly. It won't store it under the new camera name settings. So if you want to retain the recordings from previous camera names, should you have to rename your camera, make sure you have the global retain days set so that those recordings will stay in your system until they expire. So that's a very important thing. Next up is the retain mode. Now I'm going to talk about some of these in a little bit more detail in the video later on, but I just want to go through the documentation first. This release has the ability to define retain modes for the initial retention period. So there's 3 modes now. All, which is what the previous versions of Frigate did. It just basically records all segments. Motion retains only the recording segments that have motion. And then you have active objects. It retains only the recording segments that have moving true positive object detection during that time or during those segments. The default mode is record all segments that have motion. So this middle one is default. Another breaking change, although it's a warning now but will be removed in future versions, is that retain days has been deprecated. And there's a block here. I'll show you this in my configuration in a minute. It is backwards compatible, as I mentioned, but you need to remove it as soon as you can. If you look in the log files and you have this retain day setting, it will tell you that it's being deprecated. And so restart your Frigate, look at the log files and see if you get this warning. If you do, you need to make an update and make it look like the new format here. So here is an example: record all segments with motion for 7 days and events with active objects for 14 days. And I'll go through this a little bit more detail in a little bit. This is a new one: stationary objects. Frigate now will continue to track objects after they are stationary. So this is good for use cases such as presence detection, or maybe you want to see if there's a vehicle in the driveway or an absence of a vehicle in the driveway. After an object has been stationary for 10 frames, the object detection will pause unless you have stationary interval setting set differently. It'll pause until there's new movement. It's determined to be stationary if the bounding box in the current frame overlaps almost entirely with the previous 10 frames. And we can see an example of my vehicle sitting in the driveway. Here is the bounding box. As long as this bounding box or the object in the bounding box overlaps the last 10 frames, it's going to consider this stationary. And it will stay this way until this object moves, or unless you have the update interval set. And you can see here I actually have 2 vehicles, one out in the street and one here, that are showing as stationary objects. So just sit here for infinity, basically, until they move again. That's, again, you can change out with the interval setting here. And the author says of this Frigate, Blake, says that he expects this to disrupt the way few people are using Frigate. So example here is a car that enters a driveway, parks, and leaves 5 hours later will be one continuous event. If we look at events here in Home Assistant now, or under Frigate, and I look at the driveway, and I look at, we'll just look at today for a date picker. By the way, that's a new feature as well. We'll talk about that in a second. You'll see an in progress event, and that is this one right here. This vehicle event, or this event has been here because this vehicle has been sitting here. So we'll mark this as in progress as long as that vehicle has not moved. So that's what it says here. The zones will stay with the tracked object over this lifetime. So when the car leaves, it will still have zones associated with from when it first arrived. So you want to make sure you use the right retain mode to ensure you only capture the segments that you want. So depending on the specifics, and they say room here because that's the example he's using. Depending on the specifics of your room, you may need to tune your resolution and motion settings to get the results you want. So he actually reduced his resolution to 640 by 360, increased the contour area for detection up to 125 to reduce the sensitivity. What he recommends is watching the debug view, which is what we see here. If I go to cameras and click on a camera here and click on debug over here on the right, this is the debug view. And down here under options, you can select the different items that you want to display on the debug area. For example, motion boxes and then masks may be most important to you, but you can see this stuff here by selecting on it. If I take the bounding box off, you're not going to see any of that either. So you want to leave at least bounding box on. Okay, so those are some stationary object settings. There are some specific config file settings for stationary objects. You can set the frequency for running detection on stationary objects, which is default of 0. When it's 0, the detection will never be run on stationary objects. If it's set to 10, it will be run every 10th frame. So there's another optional setting here, which is threshold. That's the number of frames without a position change for an object to be considered stationary. So that would be default, would be 10 times the frame rate. In this case, if your frame rate's 5 frames per second, it would be 10 seconds because it's set to 50. And that's how I've left mine. And then you have this max frames setting as well. This one's probably more important than the rest of them. Define the number or define a maximum number of frames for tracking a stationary object. So by default, it's set not to track and it tracks forever. This can help with false positives for objects that should be stationary for a limited amount of time. So it can also be used to disable stationary object tracking. So in this example, you may want to set a value for person, but leave car at the default. So in this case, default here is listed as 3000, but it's defaulted to not set. And then objects is set to person 1000 frames. So you can do the math on that. If you're doing 5 frames per second divided by 1000 frames, that would be quite a while. So you probably want to set person and leave car if you're tracking cars as default. All right, so in progress events and cache handling. Now this is an update to the way stuff is stored on your drive, and it can help prolong the lifetime of SDs and SSDs. What that means is events are now stored in the database while in progress, which we saw here under events. You can see that there is an in progress event. It's in the database, but it's not necessarily written to the disk yet. Recording segments written to the cache are now only moved to the recordings folder if they overlap with an event, so an in progress event as well. For those with retained days set to 0, this eliminates disk I/O when there are no events. That's important for SD and SSD lifetime. Frigate will no longer store a minimum of 5 minutes of recording segments for each camera, so you can enable recording without worrying about the SD SSD wear, which I talked about. Lastly, there is more proactive cache maintenance to prevent the cache from filling up. You should never see more than 7 segments in the cache for each camera. You can also see the time it takes to copy the recordings by looking in the debug in the logger or setting debug in the logger config. So additional error handling was also added to prevent the cache maintenance thread from stopping on errors. Now that recordings are managed proactively, recordings are expired according to the retention settings at an interval set in the expire interval setting. It defaults to once per hour. So now you're getting rid of recordings every hour on the retention. So if you have something if you have your retention set to 5 days, 5 days and 1 hour ago recordings, and anything prior to that will be deleted. So that's where you would set your expire interval. And then we have some motion detection improvements here. This is important as well. Point 9 introduced dynamic motion sensitivity, which was not very good, had some issues. It increased motion detection sensitivity, and it also increased CPU utilization because you're looking at more motion causing more processing to be done. It also increased false positive detections due to increased frequency for detections and areas without substantial motion. So what they've done, or what he's done in this version, is he's reset it back to the better defaults for frame height and contour area. If you have customized either the frame height or the contour area, the recommendation is you take all that stuff out and start fresh. Take it out, let it run for a little bit, watch the debug window, and see if it works fine without making any changes. If you have to make changes, remember smaller numbers are more sensitive and larger numbers are less sensitive. For very high resolutions with very small objects, the frame height may also need to be increased. So if you're running a 4K stream as your detect stream, rather than using something like a substream, you're probably going to have to adjust your frame height to be able to detect smaller objects. Otherwise, they're not going to get detected. So keep that in mind when you change the resolution of what you're using for your detect stream. There's also dynamic contrast adjustment for motion detection. That will improve night vision or nighttime detection, especially when using infrared and you're going black and white. It brings out the contrast between the object and the background noise that usually gets worse at nighttime. A whole bunch of other changes, which you can read through right here. I won't go through all those in detail. Again, I'll link the link to this particular page in the description down below so you can go read it again at your leisure. All right, so let me go into a configuration file setup that I have, and we'll walk through the setup and what I have done to set mine up, and then talk about some nuances and observations that I've seen. So this is my driveway camera. It's got both a detect stream, which is the substream, and then the main stream for the recording. So it detects on the lower resolution stream, but then when I want it recording, it gives the full res recording. This is all talked about in my previous Frigate videos. I have a series of these you can watch, which I will also link below, and it's also a full playlist, so check out that playlist. And my detect is set, of course, to my substream resolution 640 by 480 at 5 frames per second. Now, in playing with this a little bit, I've played around with the stationary settings. So if you look again at our release here, we can see that we have our detect stationary interval threshold max frames. And I've set that here. Max frames, objects, person 100. And then, of course, I'm tracking person, dog, bicycle, cat, car. So the only stationary object change I've made is to set person to 100. Now, I should probably do that for dog, cat, and these others as well. But in testing, this is what I'm playing with. It seems to work okay so far. This is something you'll probably have to tweak around with or play around with and tweak to your personal preference based on your environment. Every camera is in a different environment. And if you're inside, outside, nighttime, daytime, 4K, HD, 1080, 720, there's got a lot of different variables that I can't test for here. So make sure you're playing with this to get exactly the way you want it to work. Of course, I have my masking set up as I've talked about in previous videos. Look at what masking does. I will make a mention about mask here in a little bit about something that I was doing wrong. I didn't even realize until I updated to 10 and I saw some weird behavior. I've got my MQTT stuff going on. My snapshots are set up here. And then as I come down here, what I want to do is talk about this new feature, or the new settings, the way you set these up in your file. So I've gotten rid of retain days, and it's been changed to a retain subject here. And then you set your days and your type of retain mode. So in this case, the way the driveway camera is set up is I want to record 24 by 7, which is the way it worked before. If you look at the notes here, when we talk about the different modes, the retain all mode records all recording segments. This is consistent with previous behavior. I just want a 24 by 7 recording on the driveway camera. And then motion retains all motion segments. So keep that in mind here as we talk about this. So I'm retaining 3 days of all motion on or all recording segments on the camera. A segment is just like a frame, a portion of the recording. I'm recording that 24/7 all the time. And then for any events, I can set that separately. So I want to retain for 5 days any motion type events. So retain everything for 3 days and default 5 days for motion. Now you can change this again to active objects. It's only going to retain the recording segments that have a moving true positive active object that is being tracked. So you get a very short recording segment based on when the object being tracked is in the frame or in those segments that are being recorded. So this will reduce your recording size quite a bit because all you're doing is recording a very small section of what's going on. I've gone back to actually recording motion here because what I want to do is as soon as motion is detected within the segments, I want it to store that. I'm going to default on getting more recordings rather than default on getting fewer recordings. Some of the cameras I run, I'll probably set to active only because they're not as important as the front cameras. So again, tweak this to your setting. Now, what I've noticed here, and the reason I changed this from the way it was before, and by the way I did have it before was motion was up here and then active only down here, is I was not getting all of the 24/7 recordings. I thought there was a problem with it, but really it was just because of the way I had this set. So you have to be careful the way these are set in order to get exactly what you want in terms of recording. The important part here is to go into your media folder. If this is where you're storing it, look at Frigate, look at your clips versus your recording. So if I look at clips here, look at today, these are all the clips that I've got going. Now, if I look at this one, I think this is the right one. See, this is 19 minutes long. You can see that right here. This is the in progress clip that's going on with the stationary object. And it's because I'm recording all objects or all stuff, or this is the 24/7 that I talked about here. I'm recording all segments and keeping those for 3 days. So it's recording that here. This recording here, which is only 26 seconds long, is based on this second section. Events retain default mode is motion. So I'm going to record only motion in the frame, and then there is a buffer length pre and post capture. It looks like the post capture is working as expected. So anytime that goes out of frame, I'm going to get a post capture of 15 seconds. So that's a pretty long time there. I may shorten that a little bit. Now here's another 26-second recording, which is motion only. And here's one's 26 motion only, events only. So I'm getting these right here, retain events for 5 and only on the motion. Now, if we go back over to the recordings versus the clips and look at today, and we look at the time, we should have a single recording. This one's 51 minutes because we're only 51 minutes into the hour. This one is also 51 minutes because we're 51 minutes into the hour. If you look at the way recordings are done, for every hour of the day, there's a folder for those recordings. Now let me go back to where I had the settings prior to setting it to all for that first block. And you can see here, there's a 2-minute recording of just motion. And this starts at 6:19 a.m. And as you watch the numbers here, you should see the time actually jump up, because what it's doing is it's putting a bunch of different motion segments into one video for the day. So there's 6:21. And so what this leads me to think is that if you have recordings that are being recorded over time, if you set the settings here to do motion up here versus events, that you're only going to have recordings saved for motion. So again, if you're trying to do 24/7 recording, make sure you set that first one to all up here. I'm still a little confused by this, to be honest. If I look at this and I had this set to motion, why am I only getting time from this period of time? Let me go back one day where I had this running. I started this yesterday and see if I see, yeah, okay. So it's still doing it by hour. So if I look at, let's say this hour here and look at this one, this starts at 2200. It's only 20 seconds. That means there's probably one event only there. So let me go back a little bit farther. This one is 1:50 and it starts at 2000 hours, so 8 p.m. And if that event goes by now this one's at 2013, so 8:13. So I'm seeing an event at 8:13. And once this event goes by, if there's another one after this one, that clock will probably jump up to the next event. So we'll see if this jumps up to the next event. We're at 2013 now. Now we're at 2018 when we see new movement. So this does, as I talk through it, and you're getting a live look at how I process this. When you look at the settings here, if you look at the retain settings, if I do motion and I do motion right here in this retain settings right here, that means for every hour of the day, it's only going to record the motion events and store them. So let's read that again. Define retain mode. So this says store all segments with motion for 7 days and events with active objects for 14 days. So in this case, if I were to go back and set this to motion only, you would see that kind of behavior. You would see that I have here this type of recording where only events are recorded for that hour. And it will run until the event timer times out, which is 15 seconds or whatever. And then you'll see it jump up. So we're at 2019, now we're at 2019-15. And I guess it's really hard to see the clock here, but 2019 now. And the next event will actually probably be a little bit later. So here's 2028, and we're picking up another event. So this is really a personal preference thing. If you want to run recordings that are motion only and you want to go back and look through those, you can look through those in sequence. So you would get one clip with a whole bunch of motion for that 1 hour, and that might be preferential to you. You can go into your media folder and you can look at all of those different events per hour. So if we go back into the media folder now, I can go look, and let's say I had an event occur at 2 in the morning. Someone tried to break into the vehicle or open a door or whatever, right? We can go into 2 o'clock, pull up the driveway camera, and all events that occurred in this period of time will show up in that camera. So you can do it that way, or you can do 24/7 recording that will actually capture everything that goes on, just a steady recording stream. So it's really up to your personal preference. It does give you the power to choose the way you want to record it. If you're doing 24/7 recording, you're recording to the SD, SSD all the time. That's going to be, a lifetime issue for your device. If you do only motion and it records only motion events during that time, you're going to save wear and tear. So it's really up to you how you want to set that up. So play around with it. I always say experiment. You're not going to break anything by experimenting with it and setting it up the best way for your environment. That's the neat thing about Home Assistant and all these things that I talk about in all my videos. You have the power to set it up the way you want. It doesn't have to match exactly the way I do it, or the next YouTuber, or the next person down the block who says this is the way you should do it. Experiment, play with it, and set it up for the best way that works for your environment. All right, so there's one other thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about the cards here. I have the Frigate Cards. Let me get back here. I have under my dashboard here, I have these cards here. This may be behavior that has always occurred. So when I click on one of these clips here, let me try to find one here that's recent. So this clip is 26 seconds. It starts from the beginning, as you can see here. If I go to the next clip, this one starts from the beginning, but it's 2 minutes and 56 seconds long. So there's still something weird going on, and I believe this media file is probably sitting in there at 2 minutes and 56 seconds. What I'm still trying to understand is actually how the stationary objects in progress versus the regular clips works, because I think that 2 minutes and 56 is related to the stationary object, the vehicle sitting there, the truck. So still trying to play with that. Again, play around with it yourself and see what you come up with, and let me know in the comments what you're seeing when you do this. And here's another one. Here's an example of one that's 19 minutes long. Not exactly sure what's going on here either, but in any case, I'm still checking these out, still playing with it, still understanding a little bit of this version 10 stuff, and see how this is already in progress. When I click this next button, I want it to not be in progress because I usually have to back it up to get the event that occurred. And I don't know why it's starting midstream. There may be some updates that need to be done related to the version 10 and the Frigate Cards. We'll see if those come out here with some updates to maybe make it work better with the way the new recording structure is working, the new caching structure, etc. One final thing I want to talk about real quick is what I was doing wrong with the masks. So if we go back to the debug mode, you can see here that this is a mask that blocks out this area and then also blocks out the clock. You should always block out your clock or mask out your clock. And you do that by, you can go into Mask and Zone Editor and create a new zone and then drag these little dots around, copy this and put it into your config file. I talk about that in one of my previous videos, so make sure you look at that. In any case, here are the zones that I'm using. You've got to be in debug to see them. But what I was using were motion masks. And those are used to prevent unwanted types of motion from triggering detection. Uh, you can use the debug feed to watch where the motion boxes are. You have to turn motion boxes on here in order to see those. So make sure that's enabled if you want to debug it. But basically what's happening is that motion masks prevent motion from being detected in an area and triggering the detection or triggering any kind of processing. However, let's say in this case that a vehicle goes down the road here and starts the motion trigger here, because this is within a motion area that I'm looking at. If it goes into here and keeps on going down, if we get rid of masks, it's going to keep tracking it all the way through. And what it will also do in this case is some of these, especially on trash day when the trash cans are laying out here, it will pick up other objects like person or whatever. So if there's a person walking down here and motion starts here, it will also pick up a person here and report on that person, record it, process it, everything else. That's what motion masks do. So I was under the impression by putting a mask there that nothing is going to be looked at. That's incorrect. So what I did was do an object filter mask. And if we look at my configuration file, you can see here that instead of having just the motion mask, which I also want there, it prevents anything starting in that area from triggering motion. This might be redundant, but I'm going to leave it there for now. What I've also done is done a mask under the object tracking. I believe you can go as an individual object and put masks, but I'm doing mask tracking for all of these items down in that area. So in that mask area that I showed you, that area right here, all objects in this area are going to be masked. So this is motion masking as well as object masking. So in my config file, I put that under objects mask. And now if motion starts up in this area and continues here, it will stop tracking the objects once it gets into this masked area. Before, it would continue to track it. If motion started within this area, it would continue to track it all the way through. So that's one final thing I want to talk about. I will link this particular document as well into the description below so you can read about it more. But here you go. Object filters are used to filter out false positives for a given object based on location. So there are two different options. I was doing it wrong. I was using motion masks for everything, assuming that's the way it worked. And so now I'm using motion masks and object filter masks. So that's what I wanted to talk about with version 0.10 Frigate. A lot of changes there, some cool new features, some updates. I'm still waiting to see if those Frigate cards will update in a subsequent version or an update of Home Assistant, just to see if that behaves better. If I'm incorrect about anything I said here, I'm okay for you to tell me. Just put those in the comments down below and we can have a discussion about that. Let me know if you have any other questions in the comments. Also use my Discord. And thanks for watching. We will see you on the next video.